No mai hoki mai tātou, welcome to End Zone Focus. I'm Mania Clarke at this year's celebrations at Turangawaewae Marae in Ngaruawahia of the coronation of the Maori King, King Tureis. My special guest is Archbishop of Aotearoa, the Most Reverend William Brown Turei, who shares his knowledge about the impact on Maoridom of the gospel message, which was first preached to a combined Maori and European congregation nearly 200 years ago. That event was at the invitation of Northland's Ngāpuhi chief Ruatara, and Archbishop Tureis explained to me how the relationship between Reverend Samuel Marsden and Chief Ruatara first began.
The relationship was rather tragic, I suppose, in a way that, like Maoris of those early days, Maori are still adventurous, I think, they want to find out what. And I think the idea is that they heard about the mana of England, and being a person or standing, who wanted to find out just what this mana, how it eventuated. But unfortunately, he found a way over there, but the captain of the ship treated him rather badly. And so there was a ship coming back to New Zealand, so he was more or less dumped on this ship. And Marsden was on the same ship that was coming back and noticed him and took care of him, and arrived in Australia, and he recuperated and started learning something about the gospel, and so it developed. And it's amazing how God finds a way for spreading his gospel.
So tell us about that. How did Reverend Marsden arrive here in Aotearoa to preach?
I think Marsden was chaplain looking at prisoners in Australia, and he became chaplain to the prison colony there. And as I say, when he came out, then he got to meet some New Zealanders, and a number of them, I think, were related to Ruatara. And so the desire to come over to New Zealand, I think, was probably in the conversation, and Ruatara was instrumental in making that happen.
On the day itself, who was there?
Some very important chiefs of Ruatara's tribe, I think, who heard the message, and no doubt instructed by Ruatara how to behave. And one of the interesting things, I think, I suppose the Pākehās that were in Marsden's group probably had second thoughts about what happened, because they turned on a haka. And of course, according to the history books, the Pākehās went away with second thoughts or wondered what it was all about. But I think it was how they expressed their feelings about what was said.
And how did they react? Were they receptive?
I think probably didn't quite understand the message. And Ruatara, I think, again, came to the fore and said, well, what you've heard, probably you don't understand, but mātawa, in time, you will.
How did the gospel or the message, how did that spread through the north?
The thing about the history, I think, of Christianity, and sometimes it happens in tragedies, dispersion, for instance, and when they are dispersed, they take the message to where they've been forced to go, and so, and the same thing I think happened with the Maori. For instance, the East Coast, where I come from, North came down, took prisoners, and took them up north for whatever reason. I'm not too sure, but certainly, and were rescued by the missionaries up there, taught the gospel, and then when the time was right, they sent them back. And the East Coast was missionized by Maoris. And so that's how we got the message, and we're celebrating that event also.
Tell us about when the first Maori Bible was printed and what effect that had.
When the Old Testament was translated, I don't know, it might have just happened, but you will find that was the rise of a lot of prophets, Maori prophets, because they saw their own development, I suppose, and own calling to whatever it is that they read in the Old Testament. And when you compare the early Jewish history with that the tikanga of the Jews and the tikanga Māori, there's a similarity about it. And I think suddenly cottoned on to, hey, this is us. And amazingly, after the translation of the Old Testament, there was a burst of prophets, Maori prophets. Ratana, for instance, there's another, again, he set out as a healer and then developed into a religion. Ringatu, on the other hand, also was from scriptures developed, and so it goes on.
Why did the missionaries support the establishment of the Treaty of Waitangi?
I think at the time the influx of Pākehā, like sailors and the like, probably a rather rowdy lot, and no respect for persons or property, and that's when, because at that time I don't think there was any order like police or courts or anything like that, and I think because of that they felt that by establishing the Treaty of Waitangi, then the English system of control or discipline or whatever could eventuate. And so I'm almost certain that's why the early missionaries tautoko and of course I think they had to put it across to the Maoris, and there was for and against, and I think it took the leaders of Ngāpuhi to say, we will do it, so they signed the treaty. But it wasn't easy, but I think that was behind it. It's to get some semblance of order in the communities.
It sort of didn't work out too well for Māori, though.
No, only because it was more or less written up and disregarded. Here we get all sorts of variations of what that translation really meant, and all. So, but as I say, because even Turangawaewae made a statement about the treaty, is, I suppose, because he could see what could happen if certain things weren't carried out, and he said more or less to leave it alone. It's like a rotting log, that when you start shaking it, all the bugs start to emerge. And I think that's how he saw the treaty, I think, in those early days. I think he was on his own when arguing with the whole of New Zealand. But now we've got more lawyer-minded people that could translate and could defend what the treaty, I think, really meant.
Aroha mai, Archbishop Tureis. We've still got so much to talk about, but we'll resume that after a quick break.
Okay.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Archbishop Tureis. Thank you so much for talking to me today. Can you tell me about your story and how you came to hear, receive the Lord as your Saviour?
When I was born, though I wasn't for this world, doctors of that day, two of them in fact, had kind of said we can't do any more. And the priest was called in and do what priests do in situations like that. And then I came through, of course, and then I was brought up by my Waitangi, adopted parents, and so what she said was, well, this one's for the Lord. My adopted father was a brother to a minister, and he named me after him. So there you are. I've been again to my tāpaetia motaha. Parents have said this is for the Lord, and then I go and get named after a priest. So all through my life, there was always this direction towards, being a priest.
Was that a pathway that you wanted to pursue as well, or were you just following what your parents wanted you to do?
I think I was one of those people that probably followed what my parents did or wanted. And I had no argument against it. And there was no strong desire to follow the pathway I'm in now, but there's also no strong desire to go against it. So,
So trusting in your parents?
I think so, in many cases, I think.
What can you tell us about how the rangatira, or Maori chiefs, balance their Christian beliefs alongside of the traditions of their tupuna, their ancestors?
Very well, I think, because looking back on my own parents and their siblings or their generation, they, I think, came out of they were pretty close to what we call te ao kohatu, where if you did certain things, well, you were going to get hammered. And so tikanga was very strong, and you had to do things properly and correctly. Looking back, I think they shielded us from that and more or less directed, I think nearly most of us, the children, were directed into the hahi as we know it, sent to schools and kept us away from all that, probably thinking that we didn't have what it takes to shield ourselves, whereas they were comfortable where they were because they knew how to, had the right karakias and the right tikanga to cope with all that. And I'm sure some of them saw it and were taught how to shield themselves. But when we come to, for instance, I'm thinking of Maori Turei, one of the old priests up the coast. He composed a haka called Tihei Taruke, and his concept was that, okay, let's take this Maori thing and this Christian thing, put it in the same taruke, crayfish pot, and I'm sure they'll look after one another. And when I was vicar at Whangarā, for instance, my first parish, the same sort of concept. They had a rock there that wondering whether to put it in the museum or bury it or something. At the same time, the church was being built, and the old people said, "Oh well, let that tapu look after this tapu." So that was their not to demolish or pakanoa, but sit side by side and let the best out of both.
And from those early days, how did the gospel message of peace and forgiveness influence Māori, or did it?
Yeah, I would imagine that it would have been very difficult for a lot of them to, especially when one of the commands of Christianity is to not only love your neighbor, but also to love those who hate you and, love your enemies. And that would be foreign to a lot of them. Your enemy is your enemy, so, you got to get rid of him. But somehow or other, it did influence the behavior and the forgiveness and our history, early history of early Christianity. Just goes to show just how the gospel did influence those people. So, it wasn't, as I say, although it was difficult, and yet the message eventually got through. And yeah.
And today, is the message that was preached nearly 200 years ago, is it still strong, or has it changed over the years?
Yeah, I think it's changed. And I think the way that it is to be delivered needs to change. The message out there is really the same, although it needs to be put in a different way, especially to attract younger people, and which the church, I'm speaking of the Anglican Church, I think down our way, I think it's only just beginning. We are beginning to change and using young people to speak to young people. And I think that's the way we need to encourage the younger let's face it, young people know how their language is different from my language, and yet we think they're talking rubbish, but they know how to put it across to their peers. And so I think that's where the church needs to focus, needs to get in like these huis, to be seen around. And that's where you pick up the vibes of the community and know how to deal with it. As I say, the message is still the same. It won't change, it's just the method of delivering changes.
Why do you think the Christian message is important for our people?
I think because it still emphasizes manakitanga, although, we talk about manakitanga as Maoris. We know how to manaki people, but quite often we only manaki the people that we want to manaki, not rubbish people or downtrodden people or I'll let the government do it. But I think manaki is a Christian virtue, which although we think we've got it, but I think the spread of it needs to go further than our own iwi, our own hapu, our own whānau. It needs to go to, you listen to some other talk, we're always giving a dig to somebody else's hapu, although it was in fun, but nevertheless, it still simmers under the surface.
So what can we learn as Māori or as a nation from the essence of the message of forgiveness and of restoration?
I think it's a message that we need to encourage and forgiveness, but the person who's been forgiven also has a responsibility to react and in a way that makes the relationship more compatible anyway.
Karekau he mutunga uaku mihi ki a koe, Archbishop Tureis. To close our show, Mo te wā, could you please pray for us?
Ki nui tātou. E te atua o ngā Waitangi papai katoa, uhia mai o manakitanga, ki runga ki tēnei whānau, e whakatutuki nei, e whakawhaiti haere nei, e whakawhanui haere nei, i te kaupapa o te rongopai. Mā tēnei tuāhua e ki te iwi, i au manakitanga, i o ti au karaupi ture tapu. Nō reire ka inu e te tēnei, runga te o tō māta kai whakaora, o i hukrauti. Āmine.
Āmine.
O ino kia tau kia tātou katoa te atawhai o tō tātou riki o i hukrauti. Me te aroha te atua me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake. Āmine.
Āmine. Ngā manakitanga anō nei ki a koe, Archbishop Tureis. God bless.
Bless you too.